The halls of Ravenwood Estate stretched in oppressive silence, their towering ceilings adorned with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow every movement through rooms that smelled of beeswax and old money. Duke Johnny Richard's ancestral seat was a monument to generations of power, where every marble column and gilded frame proclaimed the weight of a name that had commanded respect for 3 centuries. The London season had emptied the great house of its usual parade of politicians and sycophants, leaving behind only the essential staff who moved through the corridors like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by Persian carpets that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. It was the kind of silence that wealthy men mistake for peace, the sort of quiet that allows a man to believe his world is exactly as it should be. But on this particular August evening, as golden light slanted through the western windows and illuminated the dust motes floating in air thick with summer heat, that silence was about to shatter in a way that would expose every comfortable lie the Duke had built his marriage upon. If this story has moved you, I invite you to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories reach others who cherish the elegance and emotion of a bygone age. Duke Johnny Richard stood in his wife's dressing room, a space he rarely entered, surrounded by the intimate architecture of Danielle's daily life, the vanity scattered with crystal perfume bottles, the wardrobe still heavy with gowns she deemed unnecessary for her country visit, the writing desk positioned to catch the morning light. In his hand, he held a delicate lace handkerchief, forgotten in a drawer, embroidered with her initials in a thread so fine it might have been woven by fairies. He had come here on impulse, thinking to select something personal to send along with his next letter to his wife, who had been away for a fortnight visiting her ailing aunt in the north. It was a gesture he'd never made before in their 3 years of marriage, this small attempt at thoughtfulness, and perhaps that should have warned him that he was already subconsciously aware something had shifted in the foundation of his perfectly ordered world. He'd summoned Mrs. Caldwell, the head housekeeper who had served Ravenwood since before he was born, thinking to ask her to forward a parcel of Danielle's favorite tea and perhaps some letters from London. But when the woman appeared in the doorway, her silver hair immaculate beneath her cap, and he made his casual request, have the staff prepare a package for the Duchess at her aunt's residence in Yorkshire, he watched her face drain of all colour. Mrs. Caldwell's hands, which had held steady through decades of aristocratic crises, began to tremble. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice catching in a way that made his spine straighten with the first prickle of alarm. "Forgive me, but—" Her ladyship's aunt, Mrs. Margaret Stanley, passed away 5 winters ago. I attended the funeral service myself, at her Grace's side. The words hung in the air like smoke from a pistol shot, and for one long moment, Johnny Richard, the Duke of Ravenwood, a man who prided himself on his unshakable composure and iron control, felt the entire world tilt beneath his feet. The handkerchief slipped from his fingers, drifting to the floor like a white flag of surrender, as the first terrible crack appeared in the facade of his perfect, carefully managed life. The Duke dismissed Mrs. Caldwell with a curt nod that barely disguised the tremor in his jaw, waiting until her footsteps faded down the corridor before he allowed himself to move. His hands, which had signed legislation and commanded estates worth fortunes, now shook as he reached for the drawer of Danielle's writing desk, the polished wood cool beneath his fingers. He told himself he was looking for an explanation, some rational accounting of where his wife had actually gone if not to Yorkshire, but the truth that he refused to name was darker and more desperate. He was searching for evidence of who Danielle Stanley actually was, this woman who had shared his name and his bed yet remained as unknowable to him as a character in a novel he'd never bothered to finish reading. The first journal sat beneath a stack of unused correspondence cards, its leather cover worn soft at the edges from handling. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, that ironclad instruction about propriety and privacy, about the sanctity of a lady's personal writings, but he silenced it with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to business negotiations. His wife had lied to him. Whatever rules governed their marriage had already been shattered by her deception, and he would be damned if he'd let gentlemanly scruples keep him ignorant while she'd apparently orchestrated some elaborate disappearance from under his very nose. He opened to a random page, dated nearly 2 years prior, and Danielle's elegant script seemed to rise up from the paper like an accusation. Johnny came to my chambers again last night, performed his duty with the mechanical precision of a man winding a clock, and left before I could even catch my breath. I wonder if he realizes I'm still in the room when he departs, or if in his mind I simply cease to exist the moment his obligations are fulfilled. I have become a piece of furniture in this house, valuable for my bloodline and my ability to smile appropriately at dinner parties, but no more noticed than the portraits of his ancestors that line these endless halls. The word struck him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to continue, turning pages that documented a slow suffocation. Entry after entry revealed a woman drowning in loneliness while surrounded by luxury, suffocating under the weight of a title that had transformed her from a person into a possession. She wrote about sitting at breakfast tables where he read his newspaper and never once asked about her thoughts, about attending balls where he danced with her exactly once before abandoning her to conduct business with other men, about the way he introduced her to visiting dignitaries as the Duchess rather than by her name, as though Danielle herself had been consumed entirely by her role. I have started saving money, read an entry from 8 months ago, the handwriting more jagged, less controlled. Small amounts that he'll never notice from the household accounts. I tell myself it's practical, a hedge against uncertainty, but the truth is I'm building an escape route from a prison made of gold and indifference. He doesn't love me. I'm not certain he even sees me. And I cannot spend the rest of my life as a ghost in my own home, waiting for a man who will never arrive to notice I've been here all along. Johnny spent the next 2 days locked in his study, transforming from a complacent husband into something far more dangerous, a hunter with a scent. The journals had revealed the emotional architecture of Danielle's imprisonment, but they'd also contained something more concrete, more damning. Scattered throughout the entries were cryptic references to arrangements and preparations, mentions of correspondence with a solicitor in Brighton, and one particularly illuminating passage about the freedom that came with having money that belonged to oneself alone. He'd summoned his man of business, the discreet Mr. Thornley, whose discretion was purchased at a rate that would make lesser men blanch, and set him to the task of investigating his own wife's financial affairs with the thoroughness usually reserved for potential business acquisitions. What Thornley uncovered made Johnny's blood run cold with a mixture of rage and something uncomfortably close to admiration. Danielle had been siphoning modest amounts from the household accounts for nearly 18 months, always careful never to take enough to trigger scrutiny, always covering her tracks with the kind of meticulous planning that spoke to a patience he'd never suspected she possessed. She'd opened an account at a small banking house in her maiden name, Stanley, likely chosen specifically because it was too provincial to have connections with the larger financial institutions the Duke patronized. The account had been steadily growing, fed by her careful theft, until 3 weeks ago when she'd withdrawn the entire sum, nearly £800, and vanished. But it was the address associated with the account that arrested his attention, making him lean forward in his leather chair until the wood creaked in protest. The correspondence address listed was not in Yorkshire, not in any of the locations she'd claimed to be visiting, but rather in a small coastal village called Whitmore Bay, tucked away on the southern coast where the chalk cliffs met the sea and London's reach grew thin. Thornley had made further inquiries, his network of clerks and informants stretching across England like a spider's web, and discovered that a woman matching Danielle's description had taken a lease on a small cottage overlooking the harbour, paying 6 months in advance under the name Mrs. D. Stanley. Johnny sat back, the papers spread before him like evidence in a trial, and felt something shift in his chest that he refused to name as heartbreak. His wife hadn't simply left him in a moment of impulsive desperation. She had planned this escape with the precision of a general plotting a campaign, laying groundwork for months while he'd sat across from her at dinner tables and never once noticed the walls she was building between them. She had looked at their marriage, at him, and decided that freedom was worth more than a duchess's crown. She had chosen a cottage by the sea over Ravenwood's grandeur, chosen solitude over his company, chosen anything and everything over the life he'd assumed she was grateful to possess. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his decision crystallizing with the cold clarity that had always served him in business. He would go to Whitmore Bay, and he would bring his wife home, whatever it took. The decision to travel without his usual retinue felt like removing armor before walking into battle, but Johnny understood that arriving at Whitmore Bay in a ducal carriage with liveried footmen would accomplish nothing except driving Danielle further away. If she'd gone to such lengths to escape the title and everything it represented, he could hardly reclaim her by wielding that very weapon. So he found himself standing in his dressing room at dawn, staring at clothing he'd never worn in public, simple wool trousers, a plain linen shirt, a coat that might belong to any prosperous tradesman or country gentleman of modest means. His valet had looked positively stricken when Johnny dismissed him, insisting on dressing himself, and the absence of that familiar ritual felt like the first step into unknown territory. He took the mail coach from London, purchasing a ticket under the name John Richards, close enough to his own name that he'd respond naturally but common enough to disappear into. The coach was cramped and smelled of unwashed bodies and cheap tobacco, filled with farmers heading to market and a garrulous clerk who seemed determined to befriend everyone within earshot. Johnny wedged himself into a corner seat and discovered that without the invisible barrier his title provided, people simply spoke to him as though he were one of them. The farmer's wife offered him bread from her basket. The clerk asked his opinion on the harvest prospects. A young mother handed him her fussing infant while she searched for a rattle in her bags, never once questioning whether a duke might be too important to hold a common child. The journey took 2 days of bone-jarring discomfort, nights spent in coaching inns where the sheets were questionable and the walls thin enough to hear every cough and snore from neighboring rooms. He ate meals in public rooms where men argued loudly about politics and nobody stood when he entered, where his opinions carried no more weight than anyone else's, where he was simply another traveler whose business was his own. It was disorienting and strangely liberating in equal measure, this anonymity he'd never experienced since inheriting his title at 23. For the first time in his adult life, people looked at him and saw only what he presented, not the weight of his name or the vastness of his holdings. By the time the coach crested the final hill and Whitmore Bay spread below him, a crescent of whitewashed cottages climbing up from a harbour where fishing boats bobbed like toys, Johnny Richards felt like a man who'd been holding his breath for years and only just remembered how to exhale. The sea air hit him sharp and clean, carrying the cry of gulls and the salt promise of something vast and unknowable. Somewhere down in that village, Daniel had built a life without him, and he was about to discover whether the man beneath the title was enough to win back what the Duke had so carelessly lost. He found her on the third day of searching, though finding was perhaps too active a word for what amounted to inevitable collision in a village of barely 300 souls. Johnny had taken a room at the harbour inn under his assumed name, spending his mornings walking the cliff paths and his afternoons in the local tavern, listening to gossip and carefully asking questions that wouldn't raise suspicion. The locals spoke freely of the London lady who'd taken the old Merrick cottage on the hill, the one with the blue door and the garden gone wild with summer roses. They spoke of her kindness, her laughter, the way she'd commissioned paintings from the local children and paid them in sweets and shillings. She was teaching the vicar's daughter watercolours, they said, and had befriended the fishmonger's wife, and just last week she'd helped old Mrs. Garrett birth a difficult lamb at midnight without a single complaint about the blood on her skirts. When he finally climbed the winding path to the cottage with its promised blue door, following the sound of laughter that drifted through open windows, nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him through the salt-streaked glass. Danielle stood at an easel set up in the garden, her hair falling loose down her back in a way he'd never seen outside her bedchamber, wearing a simple muslin dress that would have scandalized London society with its informality. Paint streaked her hands and a smudge of cobalt blue marked her cheek like war paint. Around her clustered 3 village women, all of them attempting their own paintings while Danielle moved between them with encouraging words and gentle corrections, and the sound of their laughter rose and fell like music he'd never heard in Ravenwood's formal drawing rooms. But it was her face that struck him silent, rooting him to the spot behind the garden wall. She was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the costly gowns and jewels he'd draped her in, glowing with something that looked dangerously like joy. Her eyes sparked with animation as she demonstrated a brushstroke technique, and when one of the women made a joke he couldn't quite hear, Danielle threw back her head and laughed with an abandon that hit him like a fist to the solar plexus. This was not the composed, careful Duchess who'd sat across from him at dinner for 3 years, measuring every word and gesture against the requirements of her position. This was a woman he'd never met, or perhaps more accurately, a woman he'd never allowed to exist in his presence. She looked up suddenly, perhaps sensing his stare, and their eyes met across the garden. He watched the color drain from her face, watched joy transform into shock and then something harder, more guarded. For a long moment neither of them moved, separated by 20 feet and 3 years of accumulated silence, while her companions chattered on, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring in their midst. Then Danielle set down her brush with deliberate care, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked toward him with the steady gait of someone approaching an execution. She met him at the garden gate, her body positioned as though barring entry to a fortress, and spoke before he could marshal his carefully rehearsed words. "You shouldn't have come." Her voice was steady, but he caught the tremor underneath, the way her fingers gripped the wooden post hard enough to blanch her knuckles white. The women behind her had fallen silent, their curious gazes burning into his back, and Danielle glanced over her shoulder with a tight smile. "Ladies, forgive me, but I must cut our lesson short today. Same time next week." She waited until they'd gathered their things and departed with backward glances full of speculation before turning to him fully, and the woman who faced him now bore little resemblance to the laughing creature he'd observed moments before. "How dare you?" Johnny began, his voice low and dangerous, years of ducal authority compressed into those 3 words. How dare you deceive me, steal from me, abandon your duties and your name to play at being some common? But she cut him off with a laugh that held no humor, stepping back and crossing her arms over her chest in a gesture of pure defiance. My duties? Danielle's eyes flashed with something that looked like years of suppressed fire finally breaking free. Tell me, Your Grace, what exactly were my duties beyond sitting silently at your table, warming your bed on schedule, and smiling appropriately at your political associates? Was I supposed to be grateful for the privilege of being invisible in my own home? The formality of addressing him by title felt like a slap, emphasizing the distance between them more effectively than any physical barrier. You are my wife, he said, and heard how hollow the words sounded even as they left his mouth. You are the Duchess of Ravenwood. You have responsibilities, a position in society that women would sacrifice everything to obtain. I have given you everything, wealth, status, security. Everything except yourself, she interrupted, her voice rising now, the careful control she'd maintained for 3 years finally shattering. Everything except your time, your attention, your partnership. You gave me a title and a prison, Johnny, and expected me to be grateful for the bars because they were gilded. She turned away from him, walking toward the cottage, and he followed without permission, his longer strides eating up the distance between them. You will pack your things and return to London with me, he commanded, reverting to the tone that made Parliament members scramble to obey. Whatever childish rebellion this is, it ends now. I will not have my wife living like some bohemian artist while London gossips about the Duke whose Duchess abandoned him. She spun to face him on the threshold, and he stopped short at the steel in her expression. The Duchess died the day she left Ravenwood, Danielle said quietly, each word deliberate as a nail in a coffin. I am simply Danielle Stanley now, and I am not going anywhere with you. If you want your Duchess back, you'll have to resurrect her from the grave you dug with your indifference. Johnny took rooms at the Harbour Inn with the grim determination of a general settling in for a siege, refusing to return to London without his wife even as she made it abundantly clear she wanted nothing to do with him. He told himself his persistence was about duty and reputation, about the scandal that would erupt if word spread that the Duchess of Ravenwood had abandoned her husband to live in rustic anonymity. But the journals had planted seeds of doubt that grew with every passing hour, and watching Danielle laugh in her garden had watered those seeds with something uncomfortably close to regret. He began haunting the village like a ghost, learning its rhythms, and it was on his 4th day that he first noticed the other man. Dr. Thomas Ashford was everything Johnny was not: approachable, warm, the sort of man who stopped to help elderly women with their parcels and knew every villager by name. He was perhaps 35, with sun-weathered features and capable hands, dressed in the practical clothing of a country physician who made his rounds on horseback rather than in a carriage. And he was, Johnny observed with growing fury, a frequent visitor to the cottage with the blue door. He watched from his vantage point at the cliff's edge as the doctor arrived one afternoon carrying a basket of what appeared to be medical supplies, saw how Danielle greeted him at the gate with a smile that looked genuine and unguarded, saw them disappear into the cottage together for what stretched into an agonizing hour. When Ashford finally emerged, Johnny was waiting on the path, his restraint finally shattered by visions he refused to name. "A word, doctor," he said, his voice carrying all the lethal courtesy of a man barely restraining violence. The physician turned, his expression shifting from pleasant surprise to wary assessment as he took in Johnny's rigid posture and clenched fists. "You must be the husband," Ashford said calmly, making no move to extend his hand. "She said you'd found her. I'm surprised it took you this long, frankly. A woman like that doesn't simply disappear without leaving ripples." There was no challenge in his tone, but something about the casual familiarity with which he spoke of Danielle made Johnny's vision blur red at the edges. "What is the nature of your relationship with my wife?" The question emerged through gritted teeth, each word a bullet he wanted to fire directly into the other man's chest. To his credit, Ashford didn't flinch, didn't retreat, simply studied Johnny with the clinical detachment of a physician diagnosing a particularly stubborn ailment. "Friendship," the doctor said simply. "Something I suspect she's been starved of in your grand houses and ballrooms. I check on her welfare, ensure she's settling well, provide company when she wishes it and solitude when she doesn't." He paused, then added with devastating gentleness, "She speaks of you sometimes, you know. With a sadness that breaks my heart. She doesn't hate you, Your Grace. She simply learned to live without you." The storm rolled in from the sea that evening with the fury of nature intent on forcing a reckoning, turning the sky bruise-purple and whipping the waves into froth against the cliffs. Johnny had been walking the coastal path in the gathering darkness, wrestling with Ashford's words and the jealousy that had revealed feelings he'd spent years pretending not to possess, when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The cottage with the blue door was closer than the village, and he told himself that seeking shelter there was practical rather than desperate as he pounded on the door with wind-driven rain already soaking through his coat. Danielle opened it with a lamp in hand, her expression shifting from annoyance to resignation when she saw him dripping on her threshold. "Of course," she muttered, stepping aside. "Even the weather conspires to throw us together." But she didn't turn him away, couldn't by any code of basic humanity with the storm now howling like something alive and furious, and he found himself in her small parlor while she fetched towels and stirred the fire to life with brisk, efficient movements that spoke of a woman who'd learned to care for herself without servants hovering. They sat in silence for a long while, the storm raging outside providing excuse enough not to speak, but eventually Danielle settled into the chair across from him with a cup of tea cradled in her hands. "Why did you really come here, Johnny?" Her voice was soft, almost sad, stripped of the anger that had armored her during their first confrontation. "And don't tell me it's about duty or reputation. I've spent 3 years learning to read the lies men tell themselves." He stared into the fire, watching flames consume the peat brick by brick, and felt something crack open inside his chest that he'd kept sealed since childhood. "My father was the coldest man I've ever known," he heard himself say, the words emerging without permission. He believed that emotion was weakness, that a duke must be above such base concerns as affection or sentiment. "When my mother died, I was 8 years old, and he forbade me from crying at her funeral. Said the title demanded dignity, demanded control." He looked up to find Danielle watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I learned my lessons well. Perhaps too well." "So you built yourself into the same marble statue," she said quietly, setting down her tea. "And you wondered why I suffocated in the mausoleum you created." There was no victory in her voice, only a weary understanding that somehow hurt worse than accusation. "I was so lonely, Johnny. Do you have any idea what it's like to be lonely while sharing a bed with someone? To speak and have your words disappear into silence like stones dropped down a well." The storm intensified, rattling the windows, and he moved to kneel before her chair, finally close enough to see the pain he'd carved into her features over 3 years of benign neglect. "Teach me," he said hoarsely. "Teach me how to be something other than what I was raised to be." The storm had exhausted itself by dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and glittering with possibility, but inside the cottage the air remained heavy with words that had poured out through the night like confessions at an altar. They talked until their voices went hoarse, excavating the ruins of their marriage with the careful attention of archaeologists trying to understand a lost civilization. Johnny had told her about the loneliness of his childhood, the way duty had been drilled into him until it replaced blood in his veins. Danielle had described the slow erosion of hope, the daily death of watching herself disappear into the role of ornamental wife. And somewhere in the darkest hours before dawn, when exhaustion stripped away their final defenses, they'd both admitted that what had existed between them wasn't love but rather a transaction that had impoverished them both. Now Johnny stood at her window watching the sun climb over the sea, his reflection ghostly in the glass, and made the hardest decision of his life. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the papers he'd carried with him since London, documents his solicitor had prepared with obvious distaste and sealed warnings about the scandal that would follow. "I brought these," he said quietly, not turning to face her where she sat curled in the armchair, exhaustion painting shadows beneath her eyes. "Legal separation papers. They require only our signatures and a magistrate's witness." He heard her sharp intake of breath, felt the shock ripple through the room like a stone thrown into still water. "You would do that?" Her voice carried disbelief threaded with something that might have been hope or might have been grief. "You would endure the scandal, the whispers, the damage to your precious Ravenwood name?" The Ravenwood name survived civil wars and plagues and catastrophically bad investments in South Sea ventures, he said, finally turning to face her. "It will survive being attached to a man who failed his wife so thoroughly that she had to flee to find herself." He crossed the room and placed the papers on the small table between them, his hand steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I came here intending to drag you back, to command and compel and use every weapon in my arsenal to restore what I thought of as the natural order. But you were right about everything, Danielle. The Duchess I married did die, and she died because I starved her of everything that makes life worth living." Tears tracked down her cheeks now, glinting in the morning light, and he had to clench his fists to keep from reaching for her. "I don't want to be the cage that keeps you prisoner," he continued, his voice rough with emotion he'd spent a lifetime learning to suppress. "If freedom is what you need, if this life you've built here brings you joy that I never could, then I will sign these papers and walk away. Your happiness matters more than my pride, more than duty, more than any of the things I've used as excuses for my failures." He paused, meeting her eyes. "You deserve to choose, Danielle. Perhaps for the first time in our marriage, you deserve to choose." Danielle stared at the papers for a long moment, her fingers hovering above them as though they might burn her if she touched them, and Johnny felt his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that threatened to crack them open. He had laid himself bare, offered her the freedom she'd stolen away to claim, and now he stood on the precipice of losing her forever with only his newfound humility as consolation. The cottage filled with morning light that turned the whitewashed walls golden, and somewhere outside a bird began to sing with the thoughtless joy of a creature that had survived the storm. 3 years ago, I would have signed these without hesitation, she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. Even a month ago, before you appeared on that path, I would have considered it a gift from a merciful God." She looked up at him then, and he saw something shifting in her expression, some internal calculation that terrified him with its unknowability. "But that was before you traveled 2 days on a mail coach and stayed in a village inn to find me. Before you knelt in front of my chair and asked me to teach you how to feel. Before you placed my happiness above the one thing you valued your entire life." She stood, moving to the window where he'd stood moments before, her silhouette backlit by the rising sun. "I don't want to go back to being the Duchess of Ravenwood," she said, and his heart plummeted before she continued. "But I think I might want to discover who Danielle and Johnny could be to each other, if we started again without the weight of expectations and duty crushing us." She turned to face him, and he saw the steel beneath her sadness, the strength she'd forged in the fires of loneliness. "I will return to London with you, but not as your property or your ornament. I will return as your partner, your equal, and if you cannot give me that, then these papers will be signed before the month is out." The condition should have chafed against his pride, should have triggered every instinct his father had beaten into him about hierarchy and a duke's rightful authority. Instead, he felt something like relief flooding through his veins, washing away years of calcified certainty. "I don't know how to be what you need," he admitted, the words catching in his throat. "I don't know how to build a partnership when I was only ever taught to command. But I want to learn, Danielle. God help me, I want to try." She crossed to him then, close enough that he could see the paint still staining her fingernails, the freckles the sun had scattered across her nose during her weeks of freedom. "Then we'll learn together," she said softly, reaching out to touch his face with a tenderness he'd never earned. "We'll transform that cold mausoleum into something warm and alive, or we'll burn it down trying." "But Johnny," her voice firmed, her eyes holding his with unwavering intensity, "if you ever make me feel invisible again, I won't run away to a cottage. I'll simply cease to exist for you entirely, and no amount of searching will bring me back. If you found comfort or meaning in this tale, a simple like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. And if you wish, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel.